On Labor Day weekend, exactly 3 days before my 29th birthday, I watched my younger sister take two things I had spent 7 years building: my dream job and the man I thought I would marry, in less than 8 hours. By 6:40 p.m., she was standing in my kitchen, barefoot on my tile floor, holding a glass of my wine and telling me she was so sorry it had to happen this way. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the glass. I just remember noticing that she'd chosen the red dress I bought her last Christmas, the one I said made her look powerful. If you've ever had someone smile while dismantling your life, go ahead and like this video. If you've ever been betrayed by blood, tell me in the comments. Did you see it coming? Or did it blindside you like it did me? Because I didn't see it coming. My name is Natalie Quinn. I was 28 years old, living in Denver, Colorado, working as a junior interior designer at Ashford & Cole Design Group. I'd started there straight out of community college at 21, answering phones, running samples, cleaning up fabric swatches, and clawed my way into a design associate role, making $62,000 a year. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, and I loved it. Design was the only thing that ever felt steady in my life. My mother died when I was 16. My father remarried too quickly. My younger sister, Madison Claire Quinn, learned early how to charm her way into softer landings. Madison was 25, blonde, effortlessly magnetic. The kind of woman people described as sunshine, even when she was blocking out everyone else's light. She moved to Denver in June to be closer to me. That's what she said. She also said she needed a fresh start. I believed her. She stayed in my guest room for 6 weeks. No rent, no utilities. I told myself that's what sisters do. I even helped her update her resume. I recommended her to my boss, Andrew Cole, co-founder of Ashford & Cole. I told him she was organized, detail-oriented. She just needs an opportunity. He interviewed her the following Monday. By Friday, she had a contract offer for my position. Not hers, mine. Andrew called me into his office at 3:15 p.m. I still remember the time because I'd just finished sourcing Italian tile samples for a $480,000 residential renovation. My biggest project yet. He folded his hands and said the company was restructuring. He said Madison had a stronger visual portfolio. He said they were offering me a transitional support role. Transitional support. That meant assistant. Again, with a $9,000 pay cut. I asked how that decision had been made. He didn't answer directly. He said, "Natalie, this isn't personal." That's when I knew it was. When I got home at 6:12 p.m., Madison was in my kitchen. My boyfriend, Tyler Grant, was sitting at the counter beside her. Tyler and I had been together for 2 years. He was a financial analyst at a mid-sized firm downtown. Steady, predictable, safe. He wouldn't look at me. Madison did. She said, "Nat, we didn't plan for it to happen like this." That sentence still echoes. I remember putting my purse down carefully. I remember asking, "Happen like what?" Tyler finally spoke. "We've developed feelings." Developed. Like it was a spreadsheet. I looked at Madison. She didn't cry. She didn't even look ashamed. She looked almost relieved. And that's when I understood something I should have understood years ago. She didn't move to Denver for a fresh start. She moved for mine. Have you ever realized, in a single second, that someone's kindness was strategy? Because I did. But here's what I didn't tell them that night. 3 weeks earlier, I'd found something on Tyler's laptop. An email draft, unsaved, addressed to Andrew Cole. Subject line, proposal. I hadn't opened it fully. I told myself it wasn't my business. I closed the screen and pretended I trusted the man I loved. I shouldn't have. Back in my kitchen, Tyler said he thought it would be healthier if he and Madison explored their relationship honestly. In my apartment, at my counter, after taking my job, I asked them one question. When did this start? Madison hesitated for half a second too long. Mid-July. Mid-July was when she moved in. Mid-July was when Andrew suddenly began excluding me from client meetings. Mid-July was when Tyler started staying late at work twice a week. That date sat in my chest like a nail. I nodded. I didn't beg. I didn't cry. I said, "Okay." That confused them. Tyler blinked. Madison shifted her weight. They were prepared for hysteria. not silence. Here's something I've learned since then. Silence terrifies guilty people. I told Madison she could pack her things by Sunday. I told Tyler he could pick up the rest of his belongings from my place by 10 a.m. the next day. Madison tried to hug me. I stepped back. "Don't," I said. 3 letters, 1 boundary. That night, I didn't sleep. I went through every email from the past 3 months, every text thread, every calendar invite. I noticed something I hadn't before. Madison had been CC'd on internal Ashford & Cole emails before she was officially hired. Before her interview, before Andrew announced restructuring, I checked the timestamps. 2 of them were sent at 11:48 p.m. on a Saturday. From Andrew's personal email to Madison, and Tyler was copied. Why was my boyfriend on a design firm email thread at midnight? That was the first thread I pulled. And once you start pulling, you realize the sweater was never intact. The next morning, Madison left without saying goodbye. Tyler texted me at 9:02 a.m. "I hope one day you understand." Understand what? That I funded their transition? That I recommended her? That I handed them access? By Monday, HR formally demoted me. They said it was performance-based. I asked for documentation. They said it would be compiled. It never was. That week, Madison posted a photo on Instagram. She was standing inside Ashford & Cole's showroom, arm linked through Andrew Cole's. Caption: "New beginnings." I stared at that image for exactly 47 seconds. And then I zoomed in, because behind them, pinned to the concept board, was my tile layout, my client's renovation plan, the one I'd sourced, the one Andrew had praised me for. Only now the credit tag read, "Lead designer, M. Quinn." That's when I stopped feeling hurt and started feeling cold. You can survive heartbreak, but you don't forgive theft. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Ashford & Cole had a non-compete clause violation issue from 2 years prior, and I had the original files. And Tyler's proposal email draft wasn't the only thing I'd seen. There was another document, one that tied all 3 of them together. I hadn't opened it yet, but I was about to. 2 nights after Thanksgiving, at exactly 9:17 p.m., I opened a file that would eventually cost 3 people their careers, one of them their professional license, and nearly $312,000 in legal settlements. At the time, I didn't know all of that yet. All I knew was that the document sitting on my laptop screen had been sitting unopened for 47 days, ever since I first saw its file name on Tyler's desktop and told myself it wasn't my business. It was labeled simply JV_revenue_model.xlsx. I almost didn't click it, because opening it meant crossing a line. It meant accepting that whatever I found might change how I saw my sister forever. But if you've ever been betrayed, you know this feeling. The moment when curiosity stops being curiosity and becomes survival. Before I tell you what was inside, let me ask you something. If you suspected someone close to you was lying, would you want to know the full truth, even if it destroyed your last illusion about them? Or would you rather keep a softer version of reality? Tell me in the comments. Because I didn't hesitate anymore. I opened it. The spreadsheet wasn't about interior design. It was a financial model. Projected revenue streams, client acquisition forecasts, commission splits, and in the top left corner, in bold, Ashford & Cole expansion, private partnership plan. 3 names appeared under stakeholders. Andrew Cole, Tyler Grant, Madison Quinn. Not mine. Never mine. My hands didn't shake. That surprised me. Instead, I felt something much colder, like stepping into a room where the air had already been drained. I kept reading. The file tracked projected profits from 5 upcoming luxury renovation contracts. All of them were clients I had sourced. Clients who trusted me, personally. Each line item showed projected revenue, commission percentages, and something labeled internal allocation. Andrew, 40%. Tyler, 35%. Madison, 25%. I wasn't listed at all. And then I saw the note at the bottom of the sheet. Phase 1. Transition Natalie out of lead client relationships by Q3. That's when the truth shifted from suspicion into certainty. This hadn't been a sudden betrayal. It had been planned carefully. Deliberately. Weeks, maybe months, before Madison even moved into my apartment. The timing snapped into place in my mind. Madison's sudden decision to relocate. Andrew's sudden mentorship interest in her. Tyler's late nights at the office. It wasn't coincidence. It was strategy. And here's the worst part. There was a column labeled Access Advantage. Under it, a single line. Natalie provides entry point to Client Trust Network. Entry point. Not sister. Not partner. Not girlfriend. An entry point. That phrase hit harder than anything else. People often say betrayal hurts most when it comes from strangers pretending to be close. That's wrong. It hurts most when the people closest to you never saw you as close at all, only useful. I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen, and something inside me changed shape. Until that moment, I thought I'd been pushed aside because I wasn't talented enough. Because Madison was more charismatic. Because Tyler had simply fallen out of love. But this wasn't about emotion. This was business. Calculated, pre-planned, which meant something else too. If it was business, then it could be undone like business. And business leaves paper trails. I scrolled further. There were emails embedded into the spreadsheet, copies pasted into comment cells. One from Andrew to Tyler, dated June 3rd. Once your girlfriend recommends Madison internally, the optics will protect us. Natalie won't suspect alignment. Optics will protect us. The coldness of that sentence felt surgical. Tyler had replied the same night. She trusts me completely. No risk there. I read that line 3 times. Not because it was shocking, but because it was so calm, so confident. Like I was never a person in their equation. Just a predictable variable. I closed the spreadsheet and leaned back in my chair. My apartment was quiet. Too quiet. Madison had taken most of her belongings weeks earlier. Tyler's side of the closet was empty. But what surprised me most was that I didn't feel like crying. I felt awake. For the first time in months, everything made sense. And when things make sense, fear disappears. Clarity is powerful like that. That night, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't call. I didn't send angry texts. Instead, I did something much more dangerous. I started documenting. I created a folder on an external hard drive. I named it simply September. Inside it, I saved the revenue model file, screenshots of the emails, copies of internal Ashford & Cole client correspondence, performance reviews that contradicted their claim of poor performance. Because here's something most people don't realize. Revenge that explodes emotionally burns fast. Revenge that builds quietly lasts. By midnight, I had compiled over 86 individual files, each one a thread, each one connected. But there was one piece still missing, something that bothered me more than anything else. The spreadsheet proved they planned to push me out. It proved financial collusion, but it didn't explain why Tyler, a financial analyst with no background in interior design, was involved in a design firm expansion. That made no sense. Unless he wasn't just involved financially, unless he had access to something more valuable than design expertise, something I hadn't considered yet. The answer came the next morning. At 8:03 a.m., I received an automated email notification from my former work account, the one I still technically had access to because IT hadn't revoked my credentials yet. Subject line: Client contract authorization. Signature verification required. Attached was a scanned contract for a new $1.2 million commercial renovation project. Lead designer listed, Madison Quinn. But the digital signature at the bottom was mine. Not just my name, my actual verified digital signature, ID, the one only I could legally authorize. That's when my stomach finally tightened. Because suddenly, this wasn't just betrayal. It wasn't just career sabotage. It was something else entirely. Something that could cross into criminal territory. And I realized in that quiet moment staring at my own forged signature, one chilling truth. They hadn't just planned to replace me. They had planned to use me, even after I was gone. And I still didn't know how deep that went. At exactly 7:32 a.m. on the first Monday of December, I printed out a contract with my forged digital signature on it, slid it into a manila folder, and walked into a bank where I knew 3 people's lives could begin unraveling with a single verification request. The contract was worth $1.2 million. The signature at the bottom, mine. The authorization date, 3 days after I had already been officially removed from client lead access. That detail mattered, because in the United States, digital signature authorization logs aren't just images. They are traceable records, time-stamped, IP-tracked, and legally binding, which meant one thing. Either I had somehow signed that contract without knowing, or someone had used my credentials illegally. There wasn't a third option. If you've ever discovered your name attached to something you didn't do, a loan, a charge, a legal document, you know the specific kind of cold panic that hits. It's not emotional panic. It's procedural panic, because suddenly, you're not thinking about betrayal. You're thinking about liability. And liability can ruin you long before the truth surfaces. I sat in the waiting area at First Mountain Commercial Bank, clutching that folder, watching people deposit checks and sign routine forms, while inside my head, one thought repeated: how many contracts had they signed using my credentials? When my name was called, I met with a compliance officer named Rachel Donovan, early 40s, neutral expression. The kind of professional who had seen every version of financial misconduct imaginable. I handed her the document without explanation. She reviewed it for less than 20 seconds before her posture changed. "Miss Quinn," she said calmly, "are you disputing authorization?" "Yes," I replied. She nodded once. "Then we'll need to pull the digital authentication logs." She didn't sound surprised. That told me something important. Forgery disputes weren't rare, but what happened next was. Within 5 minutes, she returned with a printed verification sheet. The authentication record showed signature executed from IP address, Ashford & Cole Design Group, internal network. Timestamp, 11:54 p.m. Authorization device, Andrew Cole's office workstation. User credentials, Natalie Quinn. Active account. Active account. Except here's the problem. At 11:54 p.m. that night, I had been home alone. And more importantly, my account should have already been restricted from signing authority privileges, which meant two things were now confirmed. They had accessed my credentials, and someone inside the firm had deliberately allowed it to happen. Rachel looked at me carefully. "This qualifies as potential corporate fraud," she said. The words landed heavily. Corporate fraud isn't a messy, emotional accusation. It's a legal category, one that triggers audits, investigations, and sometimes federal oversight. I asked the question that had been forming since I walked in. How many contracts were signed under my credentials after my demotion date? Rachel didn't answer immediately. She typed something into her system. Then she exhaled slowly. 5, she said. 5 contracts, totaling over $3.6 million in project value, signed under my name. After I had lost authority, after I had been replaced. That was the moment I realized something critical. This wasn't just about pushing me out. They needed me. Or rather, they needed my legal authorization trail. Because clients trusted me personally. Many of them had requested that I remain their official design signatory. Replacing me outright would have raised questions. So instead, they kept using my identity while erasing me publicly. And suddenly, the betrayal felt different, less emotional, more predatory. Like I hadn't been discarded, I'd been harvested. Have you ever realized someone didn't just hurt you? They used you systematically, like an asset they intended to extract until nothing was left? Because that's what this was starting to look like. Rachel explained the next steps carefully. The bank would flag all contracts signed under my credentials. They would notify Ashford & Cole for verification. And if discrepancies were confirmed, it could trigger civil liability investigations, professional license reviews, and potentially criminal inquiry if intent was established. Intent. That word mattered. Because mistakes happen. But patterns prove intent, and 5 forged signatures were a pattern. I left the bank at 9:06 a.m. The winter air outside felt sharp, clean, clarifying. For the first time since Madison walked into my kitchen with Tyler, I felt something new. Not anger, not grief, control. Because now the dynamic had shifted. Before, they controlled the narrative. They controlled my job, my reputation, my relationships, but now I had documentation. And documentation is power. That afternoon, I received an email from Ashford and Cole HR. Subject line: urgent, contract verification inquiry. They were already responding. The message was formal, cold, requesting that I confirm whether I had authorized all listed project agreements. No apology, no explanation. Just legal phrasing. I didn't reply immediately because timing matters in situations like this. Silence forces people to reveal more than confrontation does. Instead, I did something else. I went through my archived client communication files, and that's when I found something I hadn't expected. 3 of my former clients had sent emails in October asking why I hadn't responded to their contract updates. I had never seen those messages because they had been filtered, rerouted, intercepted before reaching me. The system logs showed forwarding rules created under administrative privileges, rules that automatically redirected my incoming client emails to one recipient, Madison Quinn. That discovery hit differently than the forged signatures because it showed premeditation on a deeper level, not just opportunistic misconduct, but a coordinated effort to isolate me professionally before replacing me. They hadn't just taken my job, they had cut me out of my own relationships while pretending I was still involved. That kind of planning doesn't happen overnight. It takes conversations, strategy meetings, decisions made calmly, deliberately. And one question began forming in my mind that I couldn't shake. When exactly had they started planning this? Not July. Not when Madison moved in. Earlier. Much earlier. Because buried in the email logs was a system modification record, dated March 14th, 6 months before everything collapsed. And the administrator who approved the access changes wasn't Andrew Cole. It was someone else, a name I hadn't expected to see at all. Tyler Grant. My boyfriend had never worked at Ashford & Cole. He had no official role there. So how did he have administrative access inside their internal system? That was the moment, the final piece of the puzzle shifted into place. Because suddenly I realized Tyler hadn't just betrayed me emotionally. He had been inside my professional world long before Madison ever arrived. And I still didn't know who had given him that access or why. On the morning of January 3rd, at exactly 8:11 a.m., I sat in my car across the street from Ashford & Cole, watching my former boss walk into the building with a leather briefcase that likely contained at least $2 million in active project contracts, some of which had been signed using my stolen credentials. By then, I had already filed a formal digital signature fraud report. And once that kind of report is filed, a clock starts ticking. Companies can stall emotionally. They cannot stall legally. Within 10 business days, they must respond with documentation. Within 30, investigators can request internal audits. Ashford & Cole was now on that clock, and they knew it. Before I explain what happened next, let me ask you something. If you discovered 3 people had quietly built a system to profit from you while erasing you, would you confront them immediately, or would you wait until they were trapped by their own paper trail? Because I chose the second option, and that decision changed everything. By early January, the first official response from Ashford & Cole arrived. It was a letter from their legal counsel. 12 pages. Dense, cold, predictable. They denied intentional misconduct. They claimed my credentials had been used under administrative oversight during a transitional workflow period. In plain English, they admitted using my access, but framed it as routine procedure. That might sound convincing, except for one fatal flaw. They had no legal authority to sign contracts under my name without explicit written consent, and they had none, which meant their defense strategy was simple: delay, minimize, hope I back down. Most employees do, because corporate legal battles are expensive, slow, and exhausting. But here's something they didn't know about me. I wasn't trying to win emotionally. I was building leverage, and leverage grows quietly. That same week, I met with an employment attorney named Daniel Reeves, late 50s, former federal compliance investigator. The kind of lawyer who spoke less and listened more. I handed him the folder containing forged signature logs, email redirection records, the revenue partnership spreadsheet, Tyler's administrative access authorization. He reviewed everything without interruption. When he finished, he leaned back and said one sentence that changed the direction of my thinking completely. This isn't just employment misconduct. This is coordinated financial extraction. Coordinated. That word mattered, because it meant multiple parties knowingly working together with intent, which legally opens doors to much more serious consequences. Civil conspiracy, fraud, professional license violations. and potentially criminal liability, depending on financial damages. Daniel explained something I hadn't fully realized. Ashford and Cole's entire revenue model depended heavily on personal client relationships, not corporate contracts, which meant trust was their currency. And if it became public that they forged signatures and misrepresented lead designers, that trust would collapse instantly. Clients could withdraw, projects could freeze, insurance coverage could be voided. In other words, their entire business could implode. That realization shifted something inside me. Until then, I had been reacting, documenting, defending. But for the first time, I understood the scale of power I now held. Because this wasn't just about my job. It was about the survival of their firm. And the moment someone's survival depends on your silence, you're no longer powerless. Daniel asked me a question then. What outcome do you want? Not revenge. Not apology. Outcome. The word forced clarity. I didn't answer immediately because the truth was, I didn't want to destroy Ashford and Cole completely. Not yet. I wanted something more precise. I wanted accountability. Public accountability. Not quiet settlements. Not private apologies. Because what they did wasn't impulsive. It was systematic. And systematic harm deserves systematic exposure. So I told him the truth. I want the full record on the table. He nodded slowly. That's possible, he said. But timing is everything. Timing. That word would come up again and again over the next few months. Because legal pressure alone rarely creates collapse. Public exposure does. And public exposure requires a stage. Which is when Daniel asked a question that surprised me. When is their largest annual client event? I knew the answer immediately. Ashford and Cole hosted a high-profile spring design showcase every April. Hundreds of clients, industry partners, investors, local press. It was their biggest reputation event of the year. And suddenly, the strategy became clear. Not confrontation. Not lawsuits first. But controlled timing, pressure building quietly, until one very public moment. Have you ever realized that the most devastating form of revenge isn't loud? It's patient. Because that's the moment I decided I wasn't going to fight them in private. I was going to let them build their own stage first, and then take control of it. Over the next 6 weeks, Daniel filed formal document preservation requests. That forced Ashford and Cole to legally retain internal communications. No deletion allowed. No data wiping. If they tried, it would create additional charges. At the same time, the bank's fraud inquiry escalated into a compliance review. And that's when the pressure started to show. Andrew Cole emailed me directly for the first time since my demotion. Subject line: "We need to talk." He didn't sound confident anymore. He sounded careful. That email alone told me everything. Because powerful people only ask to talk when they realize control is slipping. I didn't respond. Not yet. Because silence still served me better. 2 days later, Madison texted me. Her first message in months. "Nat, can we meet? I think there's been a misunderstanding." Misunderstanding. That word almost made me laugh. Because misunderstanding implies confusion. But there had been no confusion, only calculation. Still, her reaching out revealed something important. She knew. They all knew. The investigation had reached them, and fear was starting to replace confidence. But what Madison didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the evidence I had wasn't just digital. There was one more layer. A physical record. Something created long before they ever thought to erase me. Something sitting in a locked storage unit across town. A box I hadn't opened in years. Inside it was a set of original signed partnership planning documents from a meeting that happened nearly 9 months before Madison moved to Denver. Documents that would prove one chilling truth. This betrayal hadn't started with my sister. It hadn't even started with Tyler. It had started with someone else entirely. Someone I had trusted even longer, and I still hadn't fully processed what that meant. On a freezing Saturday morning in late January, at exactly 10:26 a.m., I stood inside a storage unit I had rented 3 years earlier for $87 a month, holding a sealed banker's box that contained the first evidence that my life had been quietly redirected long before my sister ever stepped into my apartment. The box was labeled in black marker, "Archive, 2021. Dust had settled along the edges. I hadn't opened it since the day I moved offices inside Ashford and Cole. At the time, I thought I was just packing away old project files. I didn't know I was preserving a timeline. Before I opened it, I paused, because something inside me already knew what I might find. And if you've ever had that moment, standing on the edge of information you know will change everything, you understand how heavy silence can feel. Let me ask you this. Would you rather discover that someone betrayed you impulsively, or learn they had been planning it months, even years, before you ever suspected? Because I was about to find out which one this was. Inside the box were old client binders, project sketches, vendor contracts, routine things, until I reached a thin folder at the bottom. It was labeled Strategic Growth Meeting, Preliminary Notes. Date, February 18th. That date hit me immediately. February 18th was 9 months before Madison moved to Denver. 9 months before my demotion. 9 months before Tyler started staying late at work. 9 months before everything. I sat on the concrete floor and opened it. Inside were printed meeting minutes, not official corporate minutes, informal notes, the kind people write during planning sessions. At the top of the page were 4 names: Andrew Cole, Tyler Grant, Madison Quinn, and one more, Laura Simmons. That name made my chest tighten. Laura Simmons had been my direct supervisor at Ashford and Cole for 5 years. She was the one who promoted me from assistant to design associate, the one who called me her most reliable team member, the one who told me, repeatedly, that she saw me as future leadership material. She had also been the person who encouraged me to recommend Madison when she moved to Denver. I read further. The notes outlined a long-term plan to expand Ashford and Cole into private investment-backed luxury development consulting. But buried inside the bullet points was something else. A section labeled Client Transition Strategy. Under it were 3 lines. Natalie holds strongest personal trust connections. Gradual relationship reassignment required. Utilize family and personal leverage channels to ensure smooth transfer. Family leverage channels. I stared at those words for a long time because they meant only one thing. Madison wasn't just opportunistic. She had been identified deliberately as a strategic tool, and Laura Simmons had been involved from the very beginning. That realization hurt differently than anything before. Not sharper, not louder, just deeper. Because Laura wasn't just my boss. She was someone I had confided in, someone who knew about my mother's death, my financial struggles, my ambition to eventually open my own design firm. And now, I was reading notes where she had calmly discussed using my personal relationships to transition my clients away from me. That's when a memory surfaced. In March, months before Madison moved, Laura had asked me casually during lunch if my sister ever considered relocating to Denver. At the time, I thought she was just making conversation. Now, I understood. She hadn't been asking out of curiosity. She had been testing feasibility, testing whether I would unknowingly open the door myself. Have you ever realized that a conversation you thought was harmless was actually part of someone else's long-term strategy? Because that's exactly what this felt like. I kept reading. Further down in the notes was a timeline. Phase 1, build external financial partnership. Tyler Grant. Phase 2, introduce internal transition candidate Madison Quinn. Phase 3, reassign client ownership and limit Natalie's access visibility. Phase 4, restructure organizational roles. It was all there. Structured, sequential, planned, not emotional betrayal, not impulsive decisions, a business plan. And suddenly, the entire narrative I had lived through over the past year shifted. Madison hadn't come to Denver on her own initiative. She had been recruited, encouraged, positioned. Tyler hadn't just fallen for her. He had been part of the expansion strategy months earlier. And Laura had been the architect inside the company. That realization changed the emotional weight of everything. Because until that moment, I thought my sister had destroyed my life. Now I understood something colder. She hadn't created the betrayal. She had executed it. There's a difference. One is personal. The other is structural. And structural betrayal runs much deeper. I flipped to the last page in the folder. There was a handwritten note at the bottom in Laura's writing. Key risk: Natalie discovering alignment prematurely. Maintain emotional proximity until transition complete. Maintain emotional proximity. I closed my eyes because that sentence explained every supportive conversation Laura had had with me over the past year. Every compliment, every reassurance, every time she told me to trust the process. It hadn't been kindness. It had been risk management. I sat there for a long time, holding that folder, not crying, not shaking, just absorbing the reality that the person I trusted most professionally had been guiding my own replacement strategy for nearly a year. That kind of realization doesn't explode emotionally. It settles, like cold water. And once it settles, clarity comes. I placed the documents back into the folder carefully, because now the picture was complete. This wasn't a triangle betrayal. It was a four-person, coordinated plan. Andrew controlled company authority. Laura controlled internal operations. Tyler controlled financial structuring. Madison controlled personal access. And I had been the center point they all revolved around. The asset, the leverage, the entry point. But now, something had shifted. Because I had something they didn't know existed. Proof that their coordination started months earlier than they would ever admit. Proof that Laura Simmons, a licensed interior design professional, bound by strict ethical regulations, had knowingly participated in a scheme involving deception and client misrepresentation. And that kind of violation didn't just risk lawsuits. It risked professional license revocation, career-ending consequences, which meant something important. Laura wasn't just vulnerable legally, she was vulnerable psychologically. Because people who build their identity around professional reputation fear public exposure more than financial loss. And that fear could be leveraged. But there was still one detail I hadn't fully understood. Why had Laura taken such a personal interest in replacing me specifically? Not just strategically, but intensely. The answer came when I noticed a sealed envelope tucked behind the meeting notes. It had my name written on it, in Laura's handwriting, and it had never been opened. I didn't remember ever seeing it before, which meant one thing. It had been placed there, deliberately, hidden, waiting. And as I turned it over in my hands, I realized something unsettling. This envelope had been written months before everything fell apart, before Madison moved, before Tyler's betrayal, before my demotion, which meant whatever was inside, Laura had known something about me long before I ever suspected she wasn't on my side. On February 2nd, at exactly 6:58 p.m., I sat alone at my kitchen table with a sealed envelope that had my name written on it in Laura Simmons' handwriting, dated 10 months before my demotion. And I realized I was about to learn whether I had been a target or a threat. The envelope was thick, not bulky, just deliberate. The kind of thing someone writes when they believe documentation may one day matter. I didn't rush, because once opened, you can't unread something. If you've ever stood at the edge of a truth that might permanently alter how you see your own past, you know this pause. That quiet calculation. Do I want clarity, or can I survive ambiguity a little longer? I chose clarity. Inside were 3 items: a printed email chain, a copy of an internal performance assessment, and a handwritten note. The email chain was dated January 12th, more than a year ago. From Andrew Cole to Laura Simmons. Subject: succession planning. The conversation was brief, but pointed. Andrew wrote, "Natalie's client retention rate is now 84%. If this trend continues, she'll control over half of our private accounts within 18 months. Laura replied, "She's loyal, not ambitious." Andrew responded, "Loyal people become ambitious when they realize their leverage." That line sat heavier than anything else I had read so far, because it revealed something I hadn't considered. They weren't removing me because I was weak. They were removing me because I was becoming powerful. The performance assessment attached underneath confirmed it. It was an internal leadership evaluation one I had never seen. Overall rating: exceptional. Client trust index: highest in department. Future leadership viability: strong. And then a highlighted sentence in Laura's handwriting: risk of future independence if equity path not offered. Independence. Equity path. The missing piece clicked into place. Ashford & Cole was preparing for expansion. But instead of offering me partnership or equity, something that would fairly reflect the client base I had built, They chose a different route. Replace me before I realized my worth, before I demanded more, before I understood that I was no longer just an employee. I was an asset too valuable to control long term. And then I read the handwritten note. It was dated the same week as the email exchange. If leadership does not create a retention incentive for you this year, you should reconsider your position. You have more leverage than you realize. The note, it wasn't cold. It sounded almost protective, which made everything even more confusing. Why would Laura warn me privately, then participate in replacing me? Unless something had changed after she wrote it. Unless she had been overruled, or pressured, or incentivized. I checked the bottom of the page. There was one more line, scribbled almost as an afterthought. Board vote scheduled March 3rd. Board vote. Ashford and Cole had 3 silent investors. I had met them only twice, at annual events. If there had been a vote, it meant expansion decisions weren't Andrew's alone. What exactly was voted on in March? And what role had Laura played? Because if she initially advocated for me, something, and sudden shifts inside small firms usually involve one thing: money. A lot of it. The timeline aligned disturbingly well. March 3rd board vote. March 14th. Tyler granted administrative access inside Ashford and Cole systems. June Madison relocated. September. I was demoted. The sequence was no longer chaotic. It was built, layer by layer. I leaned back in my chair and let the reality settle. For months, I thought I had been naive, that I had trusted too blindly. But the truth was more complicated. They hadn't exploited ignorance. They had exploited timing. They moved before I had enough information to defend myself. And that's a different kind of strategy. Have you ever realized that someone didn't underestimate you? They simply acted before you saw your own value, because that's what this felt like. I called Daniel that night. I read him the email exchange, the performance evaluation, the board vote reference. He was quiet for several seconds before he said something that shifted the battlefield entirely. If a board vote occurred regarding succession or equity redistribution, and you were intentionally excluded despite documented eligibility, that opens fiduciary breach questions. Fiduciary breach. That phrase changes everything in corporate disputes, because it means leadership acted against the financial interest of someone entitled to fair consideration. And if they structured expansion in a way that deliberately diluted my leverage while benefiting insiders, that wasn't just unethical, it was actionable. But here's where it became even more complicated. Daniel asked one more question. Do you have proof of what was voted on? I didn't. Not yet. And without it, the board vote was just a shadow, which meant I needed confirmation, not accusation. Confirmation. That's when I remembered something small. In early March last year, Laura had canceled a one-on-one meeting with me the same afternoon she attended an off-site strategy session. She rescheduled it 2 weeks later. During that rescheduled meeting, she had seemed distracted, guilty even. At the time, I thought she was overwhelmed. Now, I wasn't so sure. I checked my archived calendar. March 3rd, 2 p.m. Executive Strategy Review, Conference Center. That was the board vote day. And suddenly, something else clicked. 2 days after that meeting, Laura had asked me whether I had ever considered opening my own studio someday. At the time, I thought she was encouraging me. Now I realized something darker. She was gauging whether I might leave voluntarily. Voluntary exits are cleaner than forced removals, especially when restructuring is involved. And if I had said yes, they might have accelerated my transition out without resistance. But I hadn't. I had said I loved the firm. I had said I saw my future there, which meant they needed a different approach. Enter Madison. Enter Tyler. Enter emotional proximity. Because if professional displacement risked conflict, personal betrayal ensured distraction. The realization hit hard. They didn't just replace me strategically, they destabilized me emotionally first. And that is a level of manipulation that goes beyond business. It's surgical, cold, calculated. I closed the envelope carefully and slid it back into the folder, because now the layers were clear. Layer 1, emotional betrayal. Layer 2, financial exploitation. Layer 3, still forming, involved the board. And until I knew exactly what that March 3rd vote authorized, the full structure remained incomplete. But one thing was certain now. Laura Simmons wasn't simply an architect of my replacement. She had initially recognized my leverage, which meant her alignment with Andrew and Tyler later wasn't about ignorance. It was about choice. And people only choose alignment like that when they are offered something significant in return. Equity, compensation, protection, or all three. The Spring Design Showcase was 8 weeks away. Public, high profile, investor attended. And now I understood something crucial. If the board had voted on restructuring tied to my removal, then at least one investor knew, which meant at least one person in that room might have doubts. Doubts can be exploited, but only if revealed carefully. There was still one document I hadn't accessed: official board minutes. Those would confirm everything. And if I could obtain them before April, the stage wouldn't just belong to Andrew anymore. It would belong to me. But to get those minutes, I would need someone inside, willing to talk. And I already knew exactly who might be cracking under pressure. Laura Simmons. Because guilt leaves traces. And I was about to test whether hers was still intact. On Valentine's Day, at exactly 4:22 p.m., I sent Laura Simmons a single email with a 7-word subject line. We should talk before April. No accusation, no threat, no emotion, just a quiet timestamp. By then, I had been silent for 43 days. Silence is unsettling when people expect you to scream. And I knew they were expecting noise lawsuits, public posts, messy retaliation. Instead, I'd given them nothing but legal filings and unanswered messages. Have you ever noticed how guilty people fill silence with their own fear? Because that's exactly what I was counting on. Laura responded at 6:03 p.m. Coffee tomorrow? Simple. Too simple. Which told me something important. She wasn't ignoring me. She wasn't deflecting. She was nervous. We met the next morning at a neutral place, not near the office, not near my apartment. A quiet cafe 20 minutes outside downtown Denver. She arrived 5 minutes early. That was new. Laura was never early. She looked different too. Not disheveled, but thinner, tighter around the eyes. Pressure leaves fingerprints on people's faces. We didn't hug. We didn't pretend. I sat down across from her and placed a plain folder on the table between us. I didn't open it. I didn't slide it toward her. I just let it exist. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she said it. You went to the bank. Not a question. A statement. So they knew. Which meant the compliance review had officially reached internal audit stage. Good. I nodded once. I did. She exhaled slowly. This has escalated further than it needed to. That sentence told me everything. Not, this is a misunderstanding. Not, we didn't know. Escalated, meaning they understood the risk. Meaning the paper trail was real. I leaned forward slightly. I found the February notes, I said. Her jaw tightened. Just barely, but enough. I watched her carefully. There are moments when people decide whether to continue lying or pivot toward partial truth. She chose partial truth. It wasn't personal, she said. There it was again. That word, personal. As if business decisions exist outside human impact. I kept my voice calm. You wrote that I had leverage. She didn't deny it. You did. Then why didn't you offer equity? She hesitated. And in that hesitation, I saw it. Conflict, guilt, fear. Because Andrew had already secured outside capital, she said quietly. That was new. Outside capital. From who? I asked. She looked at the table. For the expansion. That wasn't an answer, so I said nothing. Silence again. And silence forced her to continue. The board voted to restructure leadership tiers in March. Equity distribution shifted before you qualify. Shifted before you qualified. That phrasing was deliberate. It implied timing manipulation. I held her gaze. I qualified. She didn't argue. Instead, she said something that confirmed everything. You would have demanded voting power. Not might have, would have, which meant they knew exactly what I was capable of once informed. They didn't replace me because I lacked potential. They replaced me because I had too much of it. Have you ever realized that someone removed you not because you were weak, but because you were strong enough to threaten them? That realization doesn't inflate your ego. It sharpens it. I slid the folder across the table then. She didn't open it. She already knew what was inside. The February meeting notes. The email exchange. The performance review. Her handwriting. I need the March 3rd board minutes. I said calmly. That was the first direct request. Her eyes flickered. That's confidential. Not if they're relevant to a fraud investigation. She inhaled sharply. Because now the word fraud was on the table. Not implied, spoken. And here's what shifted in that moment. Laura wasn't thinking about Andrew anymore. She wasn't thinking about Madison. She was thinking about her professional license, her personal liability, her name. Andrew structured it as capital restructuring, she said carefully. Technically legal. Technically. That word mattered. Because technically, legal often sits very close to ethically indefensible. And Tyler, I asked? She looked at me directly then. That was Andrew's condition. There it was. Tyler's involvement wasn't incidental. It was negotiated. What condition? She hesitated again. And this time, fear outweighed loyalty. Andrew needed external financial modeling to justify investor expansion. Tyler provided it, but required personal alignment for long-term trust integration. Personal alignment, the corporate way of saying, bring him inside the family. Which meant Madison's relationship with Tyler wasn't just romantic fallout. It was strategic consolidation. My stomach didn't drop this time. It settled. Because this confirmed something darker than infidelity. It confirmed orchestration. Tyler's relationship with Madison wasn't spontaneous. It was incentivized, encouraged, integrated into business planning. And Laura had known. Maybe not at the beginning, but certainly by March. Why didn't you stop it? I asked quietly. That question landed heavier than any accusation. Her voice dropped. Because by the time I understood how far Andrew intended to go, I was already implicated. Implicated. That word mattered. Because it meant she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Participation creates silence. Silence creates complicity. Complicity creates fear. And fear is leverage. I leaned back. April, I said calmly. The showcase. Investors attending? She nodded slowly. All of them. Good. Will the March minutes mention equity redistribution tied to projected client reassignment? She didn't answer verbally, but her silence confirmed it. That was enough. I stood. She looked up at me, and for the first time since this began, I saw something real in her expression. Regret. Andrew thinks this will settle quietly, she said. He's wrong, I replied. 3 words. Simple. Cold. Final. As I walked out of the cafe, I felt something shift internally. This wasn't about catching them in a lie anymore. The lies were confirmed. Now it was about exposure. Not loud, not chaotic, but precise. The Spring Design Showcase was 6 weeks away. A public event. Media present. Investors seated in the front row. Clients in attendance. And board minutes confirming premeditated equity manipulation tied to client reassignment strategy. But there was still one missing piece. Proof that outside capital had been secured, contingent upon my removal. Because if Andrew had promised investors a restructuring plan that relied on my displacement without disclosure, that wasn't just unethical. It was potentially securities misrepresentation. And securities violations don't stay local. They escalate. Laura had cracked partially, but she hadn't handed me the minutes yet, which meant I needed a different pressure point. And I knew exactly where to find it. Because there was one investor on that board who had always asked me more questions than the others. One who once told me privately that I was the future of the firm. And if he had voted on March 3rd without knowing the full manipulation strategy, then he might not be as aligned with Andrew as Andrew believed. His name was Charles Whitmore, and I was about to find out whether his vote had been informed or misled. On the first Tuesday of March, at exactly 9:14 a.m., I dialed a phone number I had only used once before, the private office line of Charles Whitmore, a man whose single vote 9 months earlier might have determined whether I would be a partner or a casualty. He answered on the 3rd ring. Whitmore. Direct. No assistant, no buffer. That alone told me something. Men like Charles Whitmore, a 62-year-old private equity investor with an estimated net worth north of $40 million, do not pick up unknown calls unless they recognize the number, which meant he still had mine saved. Mr. Whitmore, I said calmly, this is Natalie Quinn. There was a brief silence. Then he said quietly, I was wondering when you'd call. Not if, when. That sentence shifted everything, because it meant he had been expecting this moment. If you've ever realized someone powerful knew more than they ever showed and had been waiting for you to catch up, you know how unsettling that realization can be. I kept my voice steady. Did you know about the signature authorizations under my name? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked, "Are you somewhere private?" Yes. Another pause. Then he said something that made the air feel colder. I knew there were irregularities. I did not know they involved forgery. Irregularities, which meant he had seen warning signs, but not the full scope. That distinction mattered legally and strategically, because uninformed investors are liabilities inside corporate misconduct cases, and they often become allies once the truth surfaces. I need to ask you something directly, I said. Go ahead. On March 3rd last year, did the board vote on restructuring tied to reassigning my client accounts? This time, he answered immediately. Yes. No hesitation. No deflection. Just confirmation. My chest tightened slightly, not from surprise, but from the finality of hearing it aloud. What exactly was presented? I asked. His voice shifted, less guarded now. Andrew framed it as an expansion strategy, requiring leadership realignment. He stated that client transition had already been mutually agreed upon internally. Mutually agreed. I almost smiled at the precision of that lie. Because it wasn't technically false if you define internal as the four people conspiring. But it was absolutely deceptive. Did he disclose that my accounts would be reassigned without my consent? I asked. No, Charles said quietly. That one word mattered more than anything else. Because omission of material information in a board decision, especially when tied to investor funding, crosses into dangerous legal territory. He continued before I could speak. Had I known you were unaware, my vote would have been different. There it was, the fracture point. Because now, I knew something Andrew did not. One of his own investors felt misled. And misled investors do not protect executives. They distance themselves from them. Have you ever noticed how quickly alliances shift when money and legal risk collide? Because loyalty rarely survives liability. I asked one more question. Was outside capital contingent on leadership restructuring? He exhaled slowly. Yes. Andrew secured a $2.8 million capital commitment based on projected profitability under the new structure. $2.8 million. That number echoed because it meant everything suddenly made sense. The timeline, the urgency, the precision of my removal. This wasn't about replacing me emotionally or professionally. It was about unlocking investor funding. My displacement had been a financial requirement, a condition, a transaction. And the moment I understood that, something inside me went completely still. Because betrayal driven by jealousy is chaotic. Betrayal driven by money is methodical. And methodical actions leave trails. Charles spoke again. Natalie, are you pursuing legal action? His tone wasn't defensive. It was cautious, measured. I chose my words carefully. I'm pursuing the truth. Silence. Then he said something that confirmed exactly where his allegiance now stood. If the March board minutes do not reflect the full disclosure you've described, you should have them. Not you can request them, not they exist. You should have them. That was an offer. And offers like that don't happen unless someone has already chosen a side. He added one more line before we ended the call. The showcase in April will be Andrew's last attempt to present stability. He needs investor confidence renewed. Last attempt. Which meant even internally, Andrew's position was already fragile. I hung up at 9:32 a.m. And for the first time since this began, I felt something new. Not anger, not satisfaction, momentum. Because now, I had confirmation of all three layers of truth. Layer 1, emotional betrayal by Madison and Tyler. Layer 2, financial exploitation through forged contracts. Layer 3, structural manipulation tied to investor funding and board deception. The entire architecture was clear, but exposure still required precision. Because if released too early, Andrew could control the narrative. He could spin it as internal conflict, personal disputes, miscommunication. Timing mattered. And timing meant waiting. That same afternoon, an encrypted email arrived from Charles Whitmore. No subject line, just an attachment. PDF, 17 pages. Title, Ashford and Cole, Board Meeting Minutes, March 3rd. I opened it slowly. Every page confirmed what I already knew. Restructuring plan, leadership reassignment, projected revenue shifts tied to client relationship transitions. But one line stood out more than any other. Under a section labeled Risk Assessment, potential resistance from Natalie Quinn mitigated through personal transition channels. Personal transition channels. That phrase wasn't explained further, but it didn't need to be. It was corporate language masking a personal manipulation strategy. And now it was documented. Officially. Approved. Archive. I closed the file and leaned back in my chair because this was the piece that connected everything. Not rumors. Not assumptions. Not private notes. Official board documentation acknowledging the plan to neutralize my resistance using personal leverage. There was no ethical interpretation of that line. Only one reality. They had knowingly approved a strategy involving emotional manipulation tied to business restructuring. And that kind of record cannot be explained away. It can only be exposed. The Spring Design Showcase was 4 weeks away now. Invitations already sent. Press confirmed. Investors attending. Clients seated. And Andrew Cole, preparing to stand on stage, presenting a narrative of growth, stability, and visionary leadership. He believed he controlled that stage. He believed his version of events would remain the only version anyone heard. But what he didn't know was that I now had everything needed to rewrite that narrative in real time. There was only one final preparation left, because exposure alone isn't enough. Exposure must be witnessed, verified, undeniable. And for that, I needed more than documents. I needed someone who could speak publicly. Someone whose voice Andrew couldn't dismiss as biased. Someone whose presence would shatter his credibility instantly. And there was only one person capable of doing that. Laura Simmons. Because if the architect of the internal strategy chose to tell the truth, the entire structure would collapse in a single moment. The question was no longer whether she felt guilty. The question was whether she was afraid enough to finally break. 3 weeks before the Spring Design Showcase, on a gray Thursday afternoon at exactly 2:37 p.m., I walked into Laura Simmons' office building carrying a thin folder that had the power to end her career or save it, depending entirely on what she chose to do next. I hadn't scheduled an appointment. I didn't need to. By then, she was expecting me. Fear creates anticipation, and Laura had been living in quiet fear for weeks. The receptionist hesitated when I gave my name, then made a quick call. Less than 30 seconds later, she told me Laura would see me immediately. That alone told me something. Laura wasn't avoiding me anymore. She was waiting for this confrontation. Have you ever noticed that when people know their silence is running out of time, they stop resisting and start preparing? Because that's exactly what this felt like. When I stepped into Laura's office, she didn't stand. She didn't pretend to smile. She just looked tired. Really tired. The kind of exhaustion that comes not from work, but from sustained internal conflict. I closed the door behind me and placed the folder on her desk. Still unopened, still silent. I have the March board minutes, I said calmly. Her eyes flickered, just once, but enough. And the investor confirmation, I added. That was new information to her. Her posture stiffened. You spoke to Whitmore, she said quietly. Yes. Silence filled the room, not tense, not explosive, just heavy with inevitability. Because at this point, the facts weren't in question anymore. Only choices were. I sat down across from her. I'm not here to threaten you, I said. That was true. Threats trigger defensiveness. Truth triggers decisions. She studied my face for several seconds, as if trying to gauge something deeper. Then why are you here? She asked. I leaned forward slightly. Because you still have one decision left. That sentence landed exactly where I intended. Not accusatory, not forgiving, just factual. People trapped by their own actions cling to the idea that they still have control over something. And Laura did. One thing. Her voice. I opened the folder then. Inside were 3 documents. The February planning notes with her handwriting. The March board minutes highlighting the personal transition channel's language, and the digital signature fraud audit summary linking internal system access approvals to her administrative oversight. She didn't touch the papers. She didn't need to. She knew what they said. What do you want from me? She asked quietly. That question mattered because it wasn't defensive. It was resigned, and resignation is the first step toward truth. I want the record complete, I said. Complete how? I want someone inside the company to confirm publicly that the client transition strategy involved deliberate personal manipulation. The words were precise, legal, unemotional, but their meaning was devastating. Because confirmation from her would eliminate any narrative Andrew could construct to protect himself. She closed her eyes briefly. You're asking me to destroy my career. I shook my head slowly. No, I said. I'm giving you the chance to define how it ends. There's a difference. Careers can end through exposure, or they can end through accountability. One leaves permanent disgrace. The other leaves a record of integrity, even if late. Have you ever realized that sometimes the last choice someone makes matters more than all the ones before it? Because that's what this moment was for Laura. A final decision about who she would be remembered as. She looked at the window for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. I didn't agree with Andrew's methods, she said. I know. I told him this would cross ethical lines. I know. She turned back to me. Then why didn't I stop it? She asked, not to me, but almost to herself. I didn't answer, because she already knew. Fear, self-preservation, financial incentives, all of it. After nearly a minute of silence, she finally said the words that mattered most. I approved the access changes knowing they would isolate you from your clients. There it was. Clear, unambiguous, not defensive, not qualified. A factual admission. My chest tightened slightly, not from vindication, but from the weight of hearing it spoken aloud. Because documentation is powerful, but human acknowledgement is final. She continued before I could respond. I believed Andrew when he said you would be offered a compensation package and phased out respectfully. Respectfully. That word almost felt tragic in its irony. By the time I realized the scope of what he intended, she said quietly, I was already implicated. That line again. Implicated. Because once someone crosses a line in professional misconduct, stepping back becomes exponentially harder. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. It wasn't anger in my voice, just clarity. Her eyes met mine. Because I convinced myself you'd be better off leaving without knowing how calculated it was. That answer landed differently than I expected. Not as justification, but as a distorted attempt at mercy. And in a strange way, it made sense. People sometimes choose silence not to protect themselves, but to avoid confronting the full harm of their own decisions. She exhaled slowly. What happens if I speak at the showcase? Andrew loses control of the narrative, I said calmly. And me? You lose your position, I said. But you keep your professional credibility. That distinction mattered. Because licensing boards evaluate intent, acknowledgement, and cooperation differently than denial and concealment. And Laura knew it. She was too experienced not to. She stared at the documents again. Then she asked the question that revealed her final fear. Will you still pursue legal action? I answered honestly, yes, because truth doesn't erase consequences. But it changes their context. She nodded slowly, as if that answer confirmed something inside her. After another long silence, she said quietly, I will speak. 4 words. Simple. Irreversible. And in that moment, I knew the final phase had begun. Because once an insider chooses to tell the truth publicly, the entire structure collapses faster than anyone expects. As I stood to leave, she said something that lingered with me long after I walked out. Andrew believes you'll never confront this publicly, she said. He thinks you're too controlled. I paused at the door. Then I replied with 3 words that would echo in my mind for weeks. Control is power, not rage, not chaos. Control. Because the difference between revenge and justice is discipline. The showcase was now 18 days away. Press confirmed. Investors attending. Clients present. And for the first time since this began, Andrew Cole was walking toward an event he believed would reinforce his leadership, without realizing it was about to become the stage for his complete exposure. But there was still one final preparation left, because while Laura's testimony would fracture his credibility, one more voice could shatter it completely. A voice Andrew trusted more than anyone. A voice he believed was fully aligned with him. Tyler Grant. And I had just discovered something that would force him into a position where silence was no longer an option. On the night of the Spring Design Showcase, at exactly 7:06 p.m., I stood in the back of the Grand Meridian Hotel ballroom, holding a printed copy of a financial transfer receipt for $2.8 million. And I knew that in less than 20 minutes, 3 carefully constructed lies were going to collapse in front of 312 invited guests. Andrew was already on stage. The lighting was warm, controlled, intentional. A massive screen behind him displayed renderings of luxury developments and projected growth curves. He looked confident, measured, unshaken. Madison was seated at table 3, near the front, wearing a fitted ivory suit, smiling politely at investors. Tyler sat beside her, posture straight, expression neutral, the image of calm financial credibility. If you had walked into that room without context, you would have seen success, vision, expansion. You would not have seen the fractures running beneath it. But fractures don't disappear. They wait. Have you ever watched someone perform confidence while knowing the ground beneath them is already cracking? Because that's what I saw. Andrew began speaking about integrity, innovation, and strategic alignment. The words sounded almost ironic. At 7:19 p.m., he transitioned into the expansion announcement. He thanked investors. He praised leadership synergy. He specifically acknowledged the seamless client transition that positioned Ashford & Cole for accelerated growth. Seamless. That word echoed. And that was my cue. Laura was seated near the side aisle, hands folded in her lap. When Andrew gestured toward her during his leadership acknowledgments, she stood. He smiled at her, inviting her to say a few words. He had no idea what was about to happen. Laura walked to the stage slowly. The room quieted. She took the microphone, and for a brief second, just one, I wondered if fear would silence her. It didn't. There is something I need to clarify regarding last year's restructuring, she began. Her voice was steady. Not emotional. Not dramatic. Steady. Andrew's smile faded slightly, just slightly, Laura continued. The client transition strategy was not mutually agreed upon by all affected parties. The room shifted. Subtle movement. Whispers. Andrew stepped closer to her, attempting to maintain composure. Laura, he said lightly. Perhaps this isn't the forum. She didn't look at him. She looked at the audience. The March 3rd board vote included a risk mitigation plan that referenced personal leverage as a means of preventing resistance. Silence fell completely. Not polite silence, real silence. The kind that absorbs shock. Andrew's face tightened. He reached for the microphone, but Laura didn't release it. She continued. I approved administrative access changes that isolated Natalie Quinn from her client accounts. There it was. Public acknowledgement. Clear. Undeniable. And in that moment, Andrew's confidence fractured. He shifted into the first predictable stage of collapse. Denial. This is a mischaracterization, he said sharply, once he finally gained control of the mic. Internal workflow adjustments were necessary for operational efficiency. Operational efficiency. Corporate language for erasure. That's when I stepped forward. I hadn't been announced. I hadn't been invited. But my name had already been spoken. 300 pairs of eyes turned as I walked down the aisle toward the stage. Calm. Measured. Controlled. Madison's face drained of color. Tyler's jaw tightened. Andrew looked at me like he was seeing a ghost he thought he'd buried. When I reached the stage, I didn't ask for the microphone. I held up a single sheet of paper instead. Is this the operational efficiency you're referring to? I asked. My voice carried without amplification. Clear. Even. The room was silent enough to hear it. Andrew stared at the document. He recognized it immediately. The capital transfer receipt. $2,800,000. Dated March 5th, 2 days after the board vote. Conditional clause highlighted. Funding contingent upon confirmed leadership restructuring and revenue reassignment model implementation. There it was. Layer 3. The financial incentive behind my removal. Andrew moved into phase 2. Blame shifting. This expansion required difficult decisions, he said. Natalie's performance trajectory did not align with long-term investor expectations. Performance. That lie would have worked months ago. Not now. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply said, then why were 5 contracts signed under my credentials after my removal? Gasps rippled across the room. Clients exchanged looks. Investors leaned forward. Andrew froze, just briefly, but long enough. Tyler shifted in his seat because he knew what was coming next. Tyler Grant provided the financial modeling that justified this expansion, I continued calmly. He was granted administrative system access on March 14th. Would you like to explain that, Andrew? The room turned toward Tyler. Pressure shifted. Andrew hesitated. Tyler stood. That was unexpected. He walked toward the stage slowly, controlled. But I saw at the crack. He took the microphone. This restructuring was strategic, he said carefully. Natalie's client relationships were always intended to be transitioned gradually. He avoided the word consent. I stepped closer. Did you inform investors that my digital signature would continue to be used after I was removed? Silence. That silence lasted exactly 4 seconds, but it felt like a minute. Because there was no safe answer. Denial would conflict with audit logs. Admission would confirm fraud. He chose evasion. I was not directly involved in administrative execution. That was the third stage. Victim positioning, distance, minimization. But documents don't bend to distancing. I turned toward the front row. Mr. Whitmore, I said calmly. Charles stood. No microphone needed. I was not informed of any unauthorized signature activity, he said clearly. One investor, publicly contradicting the CEO. That was the tipping point. Murmurs turned into audible conversations. Phones were lifted. Messages sent. Andrew's control was gone. He attempted recovery. This is an internal dispute being exaggerated. No, I interrupted quietly. It's documented. 3 words. Final. Undeniable. And that's when something shifted in the room. Not chaos, not shouting, but alignment. Clients began standing, one by one. A woman near the back spoke first. My contract was reassigned without my knowledge, she said. Another voice joined. I requested Natalie specifically. A third. We were told she had stepped down voluntarily. The narrative Andrew built was collapsing publicly, and there was nothing left to shield him. Madison hadn't spoken. She looked small now, no longer magnetic, just exposed. Because when manipulation is stripped of context, it looks exactly like what it is. Andrew tried once more. This will be addressed legally, he said sharply. Of course it would, because public trust was already gone, and legal battles were the only refuge left. I stepped back from the stage, not triumphant, not smiling, just steady. Because this wasn't about humiliation, it was about record, and the record had just been corrected. As security quietly approached to de-escalate the growing disruption, I noticed something subtle. Tyler wasn't looking at Andrew. He wasn't looking at Madison. He was looking at the investors. Calculate, assessing. Because survival instincts shift quickly in men like him. And I realized something then. Tyler hadn't spoken fully yet. He had deflected, minimized. But he hadn't revealed everything. And judging by the way he glanced toward Andrew before stepping away from the stage, there was still one secret left between them. One that hadn't surfaced publicly. Not yet. At 7:41 p.m., exactly 35 minutes after the spring design showcase had descended into controlled chaos, I stood near the hotel's service corridor exit, watching Tyler Grant walk away from the ballroom with the stiff, deliberate stride of someone who had just realized his carefully calculated future was collapsing faster than he could contain it. Andrew had already been escorted into a private conference room by 2 board members. Madison had disappeared toward the restrooms, pale and silent, her phone pressed tightly against her ear. Laura sat alone near the side aisle, shoulders lowered, looking like someone who had finally set down a weight she'd been carrying for too long. And Tyler was trying to leave. Not dramatically, not hurriedly, just quietly. Which told me everything. Have you ever noticed how people who orchestrate complex strategies often believe they can exit just as quietly when those strategies fail? Because that's what he was trying to do. I stepped into his path before he reached the exit doors. He stopped, not surprised, just resigned. Because deep down, he had always known this moment might come. We stood facing each other for several seconds. No anger, no shouting. Just 2 people acknowledging the end of an illusion. You didn't have to do this publicly, he said first. That sentence almost sounded tired, rather than defensive. I answered calmly. You didn't have to plan it privately. That was the truth. Simple. Unarguable. He exhaled slowly and looked toward the ballroom doors. They'll come after all of us now. he said quietly. Not me. U.S. Because he understood now that the line between allies had shifted permanently. You chose that risk, I replied. Silence settled again. Then he said something that revealed the last piece I had sensed earlier. Andrew didn't tell you everything. My eyes held his. What else is there? He hesitated. And in that hesitation, I saw something unexpected. Not arrogance, not calculation. Fear. Real fear. Because whatever remained hidden wasn't just damaging, it was dangerous. You think this was about replacing you, he said quietly. It was, I replied. He shook his head slightly. No, he said. That was only phase 1. That phrase, phase 1, landed heavily because it meant there had always been a phase 2. And that realization sent a cold clarity through me. What was phase 2? I asked. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked down the corridor to make sure no one was close enough to hear. Then he spoke in a lower voice. The expansion capital wasn't just for Ashford and Cole. I waited. He continued. It was structured to merge the firm into a larger development consortium within 18 months. Merge. That word mattered. Because mergers don't just change ownership. They erase original leadership. They absorb smaller firms entirely. Andrew negotiated a conditional buyout agreement, Tyler said quietly. Once revenue targets were met, the firm would be sold. And suddenly, everything shifted again. Because this had never been about long-term leadership at all. It had been about positioning the company for acquisition, which meant something chilling. No one, not Madison, not Laura, not even Tyler himself, had been intended to remain in power long-term. They had been stepping stones, assets to stabilize value before sale. Did the board know? I asked. Partially, he said. Not the full timeline. Of course they hadn't, because early disclosure could have triggered resistance. And you? I asked. You knew. He nodded once. That's why I agreed to model the revenue transition strategy. Revenue transition, client reassignment, leadership restructuring. All pieces of a merger preparation plan. And suddenly, the entire betrayal revealed its final layer. They hadn't just replaced me. They had planned to liquidate the entire structure afterward, which meant something even colder. Andrew had never intended to share long-term equity with anyone. Not Laura, not Tyler, not Madison. He had only needed them long enough to stabilize the firm's valuation. Have you ever realized that the people who betray you are sometimes being betrayed themselves, just later in the timeline? Because that's what this was. Tyler leaned against the wall, his composure finally cracking. He promised me a post-merger executive role, he said quietly. I didn't respond, because I already knew. Men like Andrew promise futures they never intend to deliver. They were negotiating the sale price last quarter, Tyler continued. The forged contracts, they accelerated revenue projections. There it was, the final truth. The fraud hadn't just been about replacing me. It had been about inflating the firm's valuation before sale. Artificially boosting revenue numbers, using my client pipeline and unauthorized signatures. That wasn't just internal misconduct. That was potential financial misrepresentation tied to an acquisition. And that kind of violation attracts a very different level of legal scrutiny. Tyler looked at me directly then. They'll investigate everything now, he said. Yes, I replied calmly. He nodded slowly. As they should. That was the closest thing to acceptance he would ever offer. No apology, no dramatic regret, just acknowledgement. And in a strange way, that was enough. Because closure doesn't always come from remorse. Sometimes it comes from clarity. He straightened and stepped past me toward the exit. But before he left, he said one last thing. You were never the weak link, Natalie. I didn't answer, because I didn't need validation from him anymore. He walked out of the building without looking back. And I stood there in the quiet corridor, absorbing the final truth. This had never been a personal betrayal disguised as business. It had been a business strategy disguised as personal relationships. And once the merger plans came under investigation, Andrew Cole's entire narrative of leadership would collapse completely. Within minutes, my phone buzzed. A message from Daniel Reeves. Federal inquiry likely. Stay available. Federal. That word carried weight, because it meant this was no longer just an employment dispute. It was potentially a securities matter, which meant Andrew's fall wouldn't be gradual. It would be swift and irreversible. As I stepped back into the ballroom, I saw something that marked the end more clearly than any legal notice could. The large projection screen behind the stage had gone dark. No visuals, no branding, no polished presentation, just a blank, black surface. And in that empty reflection, I saw something I hadn't felt in over a year. Peace. But there was still one final chapter left. Because justice isn't complete when others fall. It's complete when you finally understand who you are without them. And I was about to discover exactly what that looked like. 6 months after the showcase, on a quiet Sunday morning in October, at exactly 8:12 a.m., I signed a lease for a 1,100 square foot studio space with floor-to-ceiling windows and a monthly rent of $2,450. And for the first time in nearly 2 years, my name was the only one on the paperwork. No hidden clauses, no conditional restructuring, no personal transition channels. Just Natalie Quinn, founder. If you've stayed with me this long, let me ask you something before I finish this story. Have you ever lost something you thought defined you, only to realize later it was the thing keeping you small? Because that's what Ashford and Cole had been, and I didn't understand that until it was gone. The investigations moved faster than I expected. Within 3 weeks of the showcase, the compliance audit escalated into a formal securities review. The merger negotiations Andrew had quietly initiated were frozen, pending disclosure corrections. By midsummer, the numbers told their own story. 5 contracts voided due to signature irregularities. 2 clients filed civil complaints for misrepresentation. The $2.8 million capital commitment was suspended, and Andrew Cole resigned for personal reasons before the board could formally remove him. Resign. That was the public version. The private version was less graceful. His professional reputation didn't explode, it dissolved. Investors don't tolerate concealed risk. Laura lost her executive role, but retained her license after cooperating fully with investigators. Her public statement acknowledged ethical lapses in oversight and cited personal accountability. She sent me a letter in August. Not defensive, not dramatic, just a simple line that stayed with me. I chose fear once. I won't choose it again. I didn't respond, but I respected it. Tyler's firm initiated an internal review after his administrative access involvement surfaced. He wasn't criminally charged, but he resigned quietly 2 months later. Madison left Denver in July. No announcement, no goodbye, just a forwarding address filed with the post office. I haven't spoken to her since. And here's something that might surprise you. I don't hate her. Hate requires ongoing emotional investment, and I no longer invest there. Because the moment you stop trying to understand why someone betrayed you, you take back control. The civil settlement concluded in early September. Confidential amount, but enough to cover legal fees, repay lost income, and give me seed capital to start over without debt. I didn't fight for humiliation. I fought for record, and the record now reflects exactly what happened. Have you ever realized that justice isn't loud? It's administrative. It's documented. It's filed. It sits quietly in official archives, long after gossip fades. The Spring Design Showcase became a case study inside local business circles, not because of drama, but because of governance failure. Andrew's name doesn't trend. It doesn't need to. In business, credibility is currency, and once spent, it doesn't regenerate. As for me, I opened Quinn Interior Studio on October 3rd. No investors, no silent partners, just me. My first client signed at 11:46 of that day. A woman who had walked out of the showcase after hearing the truth. She looked at me and said, "I trust you." Those 3 words felt heavier than any settlement check. Because trust rebuilt by transparency is stronger than trust inherited by position. My income this year won't match what Ashford and Cole projected under their inflated revenue model. And that's fine, because this growth is mine. There's a difference between expansion and ownership. Expansion can be borrowed. Ownership cannot. Sometimes people ask if I regret exposing everything publicly, if I worry that I'll be labeled difficult, confrontational, risky. Here's what I've learned. Women who document misconduct are called difficult. Men who engineer misconduct are called strategic. But labels don't matter when facts are filed. And facts were filed. 3 phrases carried me through the entire process. You can survive heartbreak, but you don't forgive theft. Control is power. And the most important one, silence terrifies guilty people. Not because it hides weakness, but because it signals preparation. The morning I signed my lease, sunlight flooded the empty studio floor. No furniture yet. No branding on the walls, just light. I stood there for a long time, listening to the quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes after chaos, the kind that comes after clarity. There's something symbolic about empty space. It doesn't accuse. It doesn't manipulate. It doesn't strategize behind your back. It simply waits for you to build. And this time, I will build without emotional proximity clauses. Without conditional trust, without hidden votes in conference rooms, just contracts I sign, and clients who choose me knowing exactly who I am. If you're watching this and you're in the middle of something that feels unfair, calculated, or destabilizing, document everything. Not because you plan to explode, but because you plan to stand steady when the moment comes. Revenge isn't rage, it's timing. It's restraint. It's letting truth surface where it cannot be denied. And when it does, you don't have to scream. You just have to step forward. Madison once told me I was too controlled. Andrew believed I was too loyal. Tyler assumed I was no risk. They were all wrong. I was observant. And observant women are dangerous to people who rely on secrecy. The last time I drove past the old Ashford and Cole building, the signage had been removed. A temporary banner hung across the entrance, under new management. I didn't stop. I didn't feel satisfaction, just distance. Because that chapter isn't mine anymore. This one is. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs the reminder that quiet strength isn't weakness, it's strategy. And tell me in the comments, when was the moment you realized your silence was more powerful than your anger? Next week, I'll tell you about the client who tried to sue me after the settlement and what happened when she discovered I had recorded every meeting. But that's another story. For now, this one ends exactly where it should, with my name on the door and no one else holding the key.